All right, so I was about to share my screen. So now you're supposed to see my slides, right? Good. So, like I said, I'm going to step in with a general discussion of the evolution of these ideas that looked at the connection between language and mind and where language resides, right? And I'm going to start quite generically. I guess it's going to be a good exercise to review some of the general ideas about linguistics, right? I mean, looking at linguistics, it may be it's a simple question to ask when people call themselves linguists or people say that they do linguistics. What do they actually do, right? So, I mean, I'm going to skip this kind of anecdotal uh, definitions that linguists are people who speak a lot of languages, right? Or linguists are people who know how to speak correctly a certain language, right? Grammar Nazis who correct everyone if people are sort of using the grammar in the wrong way or this sort of thing. No, seriously speaking, when people are doing linguistics and asking a question, what is linguistics? What would be your answers or reactions? What is linguistics and who are linguists? What linguists are looking at? What are they doing?
They scientifically study languages, and they probably don't know about a lot of languages, but they know about what, like the concept of language itself, its
Mhm.
structure, probably how it works, functions in the society, or
And like many other specialists, I think linguists also divide into different fields. Some of them, how to say, study one branch. Others,
Mhm.
for example, study language contact, language change, etc.
Okay, that's good. So these are all correct answers because, of course, linguistics now is a huge discipline, right? So linguistics has multiple subfields and subdivisions and different focuses or foci of interest in terms of research. And again, it's correct answer that it's primarily the scientific study of language, right? And when people say scientific study of something, what does it mean? How is it different from non-scientific study of languages? What is scientific?
uh, probably it means that we try to prove everything with a thorough experimental design. We use observation, we use collection of data, we use classification and other scientific tools in order to prove every claim that we want to make.
Right. Yeah. So scientific means that there is a clearly defined set of theories, right? There are clearly defined methods of analysis. There are clearly defined types of data that is being used for analysis, right? And there is a certain rigor, empirical evidence to any statement that is made, right? So I would like you to keep this in mind because the ideas about language evolved from fairly speculative thinking about what is language and what is human mind to nowadays much more scientific approach to this questions and these ideas, right? So you really have to produce evidence for every statement that you're making about uh, individual phenomena in languages or individual phenomena even in speakers, and this relates as well to any statement about language and mind or language and thought, right? So scientific is really an important element here, right? So obviously, in terms of linguistics, there are more practical approaches to languages, right? And that's pedagogical approach or translation studies, right? And they are related to theoretical linguistics. But really, when we say linguistics nowadays, we are more implying the sort of theoretical approach to languages rather than a practical approach to languages. Okay, so I told you just now that linguistic ideas started out as fairly speculative sort of thinking because there was little in terms of methodology to produce evidence or proof. And even until recently, there was really not much understanding of the need to produce proof, right? People could just use nice logical statements about language, right? So when we look at the history of linguistics, and especially when we look at the history of ideas about the connection between language and mind and language and thought, we can see that some of the early statements are really not scientific in our modern understanding, but they're still important to us, but they're relative to their periods, right? So I guess we can go back almost 3,000 years to very early antique uh, ideas and thinking about language. And at that time, obviously, thinking about language was not a discipline in itself, but was largely considered to be a part of philosophy, right? Philosophy was basically the search for truth, right? And most of the early ideas about language and discussions of language were under the sort of umbrella of philosophy, right? So with time, we can see that the theories and the methods and the approaches, they sort of became more and more scientific, and it has to do with general evolution of sciences and the history of philosophy of science. But uh, considering what linguistics does, we can now approach uh, the traditional questions about linguistics through the prism of our individual area or individual question. What is the connection between language and mind? So let's look at this, right? What is linguistics? Well, we know it's the study of language, right? And it is recognized nowadays that language is, first of all, a symbolic system, right? It operates in symbols. Most of the languages still exist in the spoken form, right? So they operate on sound symbols. What is happening now between me and you, we exchange sounds. And I have this magic ability to make sounds with my mouth and make you think about certain things, right? If you think about it, it's pretty cool, right? But what it means is I'm using symbols, signs, symbols, sounds to communicate to you or make you think about something and then maybe communicate back to me if everyone wakes up, right? So it's a symbolic system and it's a communication system, right? And early on, we recognized that languages differ. So there are common elements in languages and there are unique elements in languages, right? So it's also interesting to identify what is common and what is unique and why, right? So on top, you can see the set of traditional questions of what, who, why, how, when, where, right? And that's precisely the case of linguistics. We are asking questions about language in different contexts, right? So looking at where or how or who are the linguists, we can see that you study language where it occurs, right? So the geologists study stones, I guess, uh, going where the stones are, right? And biologists study animals where animals are. So when you study language, you go where languages are, right? And languages exist where? Languages exist in communities. So people speak languages in communities, right? To some extent, languages don't exist in individuals. Languages exist in groups, right? Because it's kind of useless to have your own language because it's just for speaking to yourself. But any true natural language exists as a group phenomenon, right? So Always keep in mind that your main question in this course is connection between language and mind. So what does it mean if the language exists in a group? What does it mean for individuals? What do you have? If language belongs and exists and functions in a group, what is in your mind, or what is in your memory? What is in your knowledge of the language? How much is it really yours? And how much is it a part of the group knowledge, right? Right. And also, when you ask questions about language and mind, what are your data points? I mean, really, I'm asking you, what are your data points in this course? When are you going to be looking at language and mind? What exactly are you going to be looking at? What are the kinds of data? I mean, you may not know, but you can assume or hypothesize.
Thought.
Thought, okay. No, it's a good word.
How it is perceived, how it is processed in our brain.
Okay, and how do we know that?
How come that sound, words gave us an idea, a thought, and we can kind of translate it so that other person in another language can understand the same thought as we understood it.
And how do we know that this other person in their mind have a certain idea?
Yeah, that's what we were talking about in this course.
Okay, that's good. That's good. No, but really, how do we know? What is our evidence?
Maybe letters.
Come again? Somebody was saying something else.
I'm presenting another answer. I'm talking about letters. Letters, they are measurable.
Letters. You mean letters like in writing, or letters like I write you a letter?
I don't know. Could you repeat?
No, I mean letters. You mean letters in writing, in orthography? Letters, what written words consist of, or letters as texts? Yeah. Okay, letters. Okay, that's good. But where do we see letters?
In writing.
In writing, and so yeah.
Then I would add sounds too.
Sounds. Okay, so let's stick with letters because I mean it's a relevant response, but I would like to make a whole picture, right? What kind of letters are we going to be interested in, and how does it relate to language and mind?
I mean clusters of letters that have some meaning that we can convey from one person to another.
Okay.
Words, maybe.
Okay, words, letters, words. But where do we see this? So, for example, I'm asking you to study language and mind and the connection between the two. You're telling me I'm going to be looking at letters and words. So make a connection. How is it going to show you something about language and mind?
Maybe like the
what? Go ahead,
Rujan. Okay. We had an example last or first lecture about how we already know possible combinations of letters that sound better or worse. So maybe that's one way to see the connection between language and mind, to see if the mind has some preference to how the words should sound, and if it's different or not in like different languages.
Okay, no, that's a good point, and none of the responses are wrong. I'm just trying to make them fuller so that we all understand what it means here. So, okay, letters, and they sound better than others.
Yeah, and okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Arjan.
Sorry, I was talking about brain because we have some areas of brain which are responsible for speech. So, for example, when measuring how a person or his mind reacts to the words, to the language, to the speech, we can I don't know, use some demographic, I guess, because as I've read, there are some changes in brain, like in forms of waves, which we can like measure.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry. So going back to letters, I would like to make a point here. So letters, I imagine when you say letters, it's basically some kind of textual input or output, right? So let's imagine that mind is here somewhere in my case, I hope, right? So how do you know what's happening here when I'm speaking right now? Right? When you say letters, I guess you can write down whatever is coming out of my mouth right now, right? And this would represent in letters what I'm saying, right? And you can analyze it, right? So you can analyze which kind of words I'm using, right? So letters or textual representation of language can be either in input, you ask me to read something and then you observe my behavior, or you ask me to produce something like an output, and then you look at it as some sort of evidence of my thinking, right? When I think Aida, you mentioned combination of letters and they sound better in one case than the other. So this is already a jump, right? Because letters don't sound. Letters are symbol.
Yeah, that's I also was thinking about it. Once you started to talk about how it's a textual representation, only then I understood that I like messed up.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't mess up. You jumped over a long explanation, right? So you can look at the letters and then you make them sound, and then you judge if they sound well enough or not, right? So basically, you have input of written words, you pronounce them either actually or in your mind, and then you judge how they sound. So there is a switch from written to sound, and then you judge the sounds, right? So you're right, these are the types of data. You can look at individual components of words, be it sounds or letters, or individual components of sentences, words, or individual components of texts, different sentences and larger chunks, right? And you can somehow measure reactions or try to understand, simply even if people remember 10 words or don't, right? And what kind of words or what kind of factors make people remember words better, right? And also something that, yeah, go ahead.
Professor, I have a question, but
Yeah.
I don't know if it's correct or not. So we know that Korean people use 3 types of politeness, and they use like different words for people depending on their ages. So does it mean that for Korean people, it's really important to respect older people than other people whose languages doesn't have such differences in politeness, or like they use words not depending on the age? Like,
Okay.
what do you think about it?
What do you think about it? I mean,
or like
it's a good question, right?
This is connected to
yeah,
our mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's connected somehow to our mind, because anything in the language is somehow connected to our mind, because it's not possible to either use or understand language without a mind, right? So it has to be a connection, right? So what you're talking about are the different, first of all, the phenomenon is called honorifics, right? So from the word honor, right? Honorifics are different degrees of formalized address and classification of speakers and listeners based on their social status, right? Some languages have a lot of that, like Korean. I think Japanese has even more, right? You can speak to someone who is younger than you and lower than you in social status, and you will use one type of grammar, like in Russian, T and V, right? But imagine there are 6, right? So then you can speak to someone who is the same age as you, but lower in status. And you can imagine speaking to someone who is the same age and the same status as you. Then someone older and high in status, and then emperor, and then god, right? So there are different degrees right? So what does it mean? Well, first of all, if this stuff exists in the grammar of the language, obviously it was really important for the speakers. Was it important for them individually, or was it important for the society where the language was developing and used, right? I mean, to me, the explanation is kind of easy, because if you imagine Japanese society a few hundred years ago, maybe if you use the wrong pronoun, you can end up with a samurai chopping your head off or something, right? So there was a strong incentive to use the correct grammar. Also, it's a very densely populated place, a lot of people on a small territory, right? So this kind of social stratification, it is the artifact of society, right? It's not like Japanese people have this kind of different sensitivity, different eyesight or hearing, right? No, it's their society that has this important classification. And it has to be really, really important for the speakers for this stratification to be even reflected in the grammar of the language, right? Because it must have some consequences. Otherwise, I mean, as economical beasts, we humans will get rid of something that is useless, right? It has to be really useful for us to keep it in the language and in our behavior, right? But this is a good example, and this is probably a good, interesting research project. What happens in the minds of speakers whose languages have 6 degrees of honorifics versus the minds of speakers whose language has only 1 degree of honorifics, like English, right? Just no honorifics whatsoever, right? So that's a relevant question. So let me ask back to you, what are you going to be measuring, right? So how do you go about this study? How do you possibly approach these research questions? What kind of data you'll be using?
Like polls, maybe.
Okay.
Among Korean people, of course.
Okay, so polls, you'll be asking them questions, right?
Yes.
So what you were going to be measuring is going to be what?
Their attitude.
Okay,
to
right?
that phenomenon.
Right. So basically, you'll be asking them, what do they feel or think? So their perception and their attitude, right? So effectively, you're not going to be looking directly at some data, but you're going to be looking at what people think about the data, right? So it's a perceptual study. And as we know, perceptual studies could be interesting because perceptions can be different from the fact, right? We can have stereotypes and perceptions, and in reality, our actual behavior or actual fact can be very different. Okay, so one of my students did a capstone a year ago looking at the Western Kazakh dialect. And the idea was, I don't know if you agree or not, that in Western Kazakhstan, people speak much faster than in the rest of Kazakhstan, right? So let's take this example. So what kind of study that could be? First of all, how do you go about this this study? Well, first of all, people think that people in Western Kazakhstan speak faster. So this is already a perception, right? So the first thing that you have to prove is what?
People's
Do they
opinion
really
that
speak
this
faster?
really.
Yeah, sorry, Victoria?
Yeah, do they really speak faster? Or is
Okay.
it just stereotype?
Okay, so first of all, you go around and ask yourself, is it a fact or is it just a perception, right? So how do you measure that? How do you prove that they do indeed speak faster?
Just
Count
record
the
the
words?
speakers?
Record and then basically just count words per minute, I guess, right?
Yeah.
In a real conversation. And obviously you probably have to record quite a few speakers and quite a few speeches so that you can exclude the accidental phenomena. Okay, so let's imagine that you indeed prove that in Western Kazakhstan, people say 120 words per minute versus 100 words in the rest of the Kazakhstan. What next? So my professor always asked me, so what? So what is the so whatness factor? What's next? Okay, you show this. Yeah?
Do we
Roshan?
need to find out why they speak faster?
Exactly,
Maybe?
or what does it mean, right?
Be-
I mean,
yes.
we're now interested in language and mind, right? So what could be
Maybe
a question?
because maybe because they don't pronounce the words fully. They shorten, and
Okay,
that's why they speak very fast.
so they make the words shorter, and that's why they can be able to pack more words into the same time. All right.
And the reason can be, as a Western person, I can say that we try to convey our thoughts quickly as much possible. So the conversation can go quickly than we expected.
Okay.
And we try to say in one bunch lots of words. Even though they will be like messed up, we'll understand each other because we're trying to say it quickly.
Okay.
And
So
because
that
of that, we may just cut off some sounds, but we will understand each other.
okay. So there's already a multitude of questions here, right? So first of all, are you actually shortening the words? Is it true or not, or you're just speaking faster, right? So you can go about proving that. Then the question is, you want to convey the message as fast as possible. Obvious question is, why? What's the rush, right? So how come everybody in this region wants to do it, if it's true, right? And then it's an interesting set of questions. Maybe it relates to history or I don't know, climate, whatever. So we can go about asking questions about what is the motivation for faster rate of speech in certain regions as opposed to other regions, right? And that's interesting. But also, I mean, I'm trying to drive you back to language and mind. I mean, what does it mean for the minds of the speakers if they speak faster all the time? I mean, does it mean anything? Is there anything different in the slow speakers versus fast speakers?
Yes, personally, I don't understand Western people, even though I'm from the West Kazakhstan.
Okay, that's even funnier.
Yes.
All right. So, but do you yourself speak faster, Raushan?
No, because mostly I speak in Russian,
Okay.
and when I try to speak Kazakh, I think a lot before speaking Kazakh.
Okay, so you have to kind of prepare and
Yeah,
that slows
I need
down.
time to prepare, and when I hear Kazakh speech, I try to understand because they shorten very often.
All right. So that's actually really cool, Raushan, because you brought about an interesting second research question. Do Western Kazakh speakers speak faster only in Kazakh, but maybe also in Russian too? Because if it's only Kazakh, that's one thing. If it's both Russian and Kazakh, then it's just they generally speak faster. So what does it mean? Right? So again, somebody was mentioning, sorry, I forgot, that we can look at the brain waves, right? The brain activity, right? Maybe the fast speakers have different brain activity from slow speakers, right? Maybe they have more kind of more high temperature firing up of the different areas of the brain, or maybe there are different areas of the brain that are firing up, right? I guess you mentioned already that the most traditionally identified areas for language are Broca and Wernicke, right? They're sort of in the temple area here. But, I mean, you will find out that actually language is not just the only function of these areas. They also are responsible for other functions. And also you will find out that other parts of the brain are also involved in language, not just Wernicke and Broca, right? So essentially what you will find out that it's not that straightforward and clean that, you know, it's just here where language is. It's actually a lot more distributed. And in this respect, nobody mentions, but I guess you can easily agree with me that one way to look at what's going on in the human brain versus, you know, in reference to language is to look at people with some traumas, right, to their brains, right? Maybe people who suffered stroke, like, you know, blood infusion into the brain, or maybe traumatic damage to particular areas of the brain, and see how does it affect language. This is exactly how many of the discoveries were made. It's probably not a very nice kind of study, but this is how we identified that, yes, when something happens in this area, language suffers, or language capacity in humans suffers, right? But what we also discovered that people, when they manage to recover from stroke or trauma, they actually recover some of language capacity, even though this area is still damaged. So maybe we are able to reassign capacities to other parts of the brain or somehow compensate, right? Because people recover after strokes or after traumas, and they gradually recover a lot of capacity. So what happens then, right? So you can actually look at the physical evidence. It's kind of rough, but you can actually physically look at the brain and what's going on in the different parts of the brain, right? You can also look the other way around. When people have speech pathology, something problematic with their speech, you can then go identify these people and identify the exact type of the problem, and then look at the what's going on in the brain. You know, what does it correspond to, right? So here I would like to look at the slide once again, and you can look at the actual language data by features, or you can look at the communities, like we just talked about Western Kazakhstan. This is a speech community, right? We can look at the group and the community and try to identify the features that are shared by multiple speakers. We can also look at the behaviors, right? So how people behave, because fast speech is a type of behavior, right? Right? And we can look at systems. For example, is fast rate only typical for the system of Kazakh, or is it also typical for the system of Russian? Or maybe there are other things that people in Western Kazakhstan seem to be doing faster. So I'm just thinking out loud, right? Because language is part and parcel of general behavior of humans, right? Because language is a behavior type. Okay, so we can look at subjects individually, we can look at subjects in groups, we can look at subjects in terms of their individual behavioral feature, right? We can even just look at individual sound and how people pronounce this sound differently, right? So in this respect, you know, we can have different areas of focus when we look at language, and we can have a different scale of questions, microscopic specific questions versus generic sort of larger scale questions. All right, so looking at languages and the mind, obviously that would bring us to the question of what really is a language, right? So some of you who took my course are familiar with this slide, right? We know that around 6,500 languages exist nowadays, right? And we also know that this number was twice larger 100 years ago. Around 15,000 languages existed in the 19th century. And we also know, or we hypothesize quite kind of securely, that the number of languages in 100 years, by the end of the 21st century, will be just 3,000 languages, right? So the number of languages reduces, and it's fairly high rate of reduction, right? It's probably around 30 languages per year on average, right? We also know that 90, or maybe at least 80% of languages exist as spoken languages, not as written languages. So I'm sorry, the letters wouldn't work there, right? So we will have to rely on sounds for those languages. Of course, we write them down as transcriptions, and we still look at symbols, but just messing with you. So what happens in humans when we take into account this sort of situation? So obviously people change their languages, right? Also obviously, and we know historically, it's the fact that multilingualism is more usual and common and natural than monolingualism. In other words, historically, throughout the human history, there were more people who spoke many languages than people who spoke just one language. It was historically and still is the fact. Monolingualism is less natural than multilingualism. So, again, think of our umbrella question. What is the connection between language and mind? So now it's a different angle. What happens in the minds of multilingual speakers, right? Even more so, if we agree that multilingualism is more natural than monolingualism, maybe for us, it will be interesting to look at outliers, at monolingual speakers, and how are they different from normal people who are multilingual speakers, right? So what is multilingualism doing to our minds or our brains? Even if we, to me, brain is kind of physical thing, whereas mind is more kind of abstract thing, right? So what's going on in both minds and brains of multilingual speakers versus monolingual speakers? What are the connections there, right? So what's going on in your brains, all of you present here right now, when I overhear you on campus saying things like "Dormha, идешь чалить?" So what the hell is going on in your minds when you say these things, right? So what's wrong with you?
That's very common.
Exactly. I know it's really common. I keep recording this example. So what's going on? What language is this, right? And
So
it
I have
seems,
a question.
yeah, Roshan.
So yeah, when we speak like 3 languages, so I have a question. When we learn more languages, do we start sound less fluent in one language? So we cannot be fluent in all languages, right?
Yeah, that's a relevant question. If you operate in multiple languages, does it mean that any one of those languages is somehow suffering? That's
I
a
guess
good
so.
question. Well, don't be so rash. It's a good question, but you say, I guess so. Let me ask you, as a scientist to scientist, what is your evidence? How do you know that any one of the languages is suffering in multilingual speakers? No, seriously, how do you go about answering this question?
When I speak, for example, in Russian, sometimes I forget some words and I try to put it in English or Kazakh so another person will understand me. And I guess that somehow happens.
Okay, do your parents speak English?
Very like beginner, elementary level.
Okay, no, it doesn't matter really, but what I'm asking you is, if you forget a word and you look for a word, when you speak to your parents, you will still not use an English word, right?
Yes.
Because you know that it's useless. People don't understand you. So it's really interesting because, yes, when you speak to each other as students, you seemingly are careless because you combine 3, 4 languages in one sentence, right? Why? Because you're sure that you will be understood, right? And it's economically rational, right? You take the least difficult way to communicate, right? But when you are sure that you will not be understood if you use an English or a Turkish or maybe even a Russian word, then you will make these choices on a much more limited basis. Maybe you will restrict yourself to just one language. So you always assess not only your own language knowledge, but also the language knowledge of whoever you're talking to, right? So you kind of are thinking for them as well as for you. So what does it mean for language and mind? Whose mind, right? So you're assessing your own mind, you're assessing the mind of the speakers, what they know, what they don't know, and what you should be using to make them understand correctly what you want them to understand.
Excuse me, may I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I wanted to ask about like code switching. Is it like related and connected to the thought process? And like sometimes people say, like I have problems with switching languages, and like I want to ask how it is connected to the relation between language and mind.
That's a really beautiful question. That's pretty much what we've been talking about right now, right? Because this example that I made, it's code mixing or code switching, right? Well, code mixing more like code switching, because code switching implies larger pieces of languages interchanging. So Dormgai Chalit is basically code mixing, because you even mix suffixes with words, right? Chalit, right? Russian suffix for verbal infinitive with a Turkish stem, right? And dorm, right? English word with the Kazakh case suffix, right? So it's code mixing. But in code mixing and code switching both, what's going on in the mind? What happens in the minds of the speakers and listeners, right? That's really a beautiful question, and these are the questions exactly that are posed in the studies of language and thought, language and mind. And I'm sure when you go further, you will sooner or later discuss a very prominent theory of the 20th century, middle of the 20th century, and that is still quite popular in some scholars. It's called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right? Some of you may remember that. So Sapir-Whorf hypothesis implies, what does it imply, Alder?
It says...
Okay, sorry, Madina, once again?
Okay, let's Inkar. She didn't speak today.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
So
Sure.
it's supposed that language determines soul.
Right.
While we, yeah.
That's excellent, right? Because, but why was it so revolutionary? And for some people, it still is revolutionary, because we are used to what? What statement are we used to?
Because Professor, I think
yes, Rujan?
We used to think that thought comes before language.
Right. So we're used to this idea that thought defines language, right? We think and then we package something, like we package our ideas into the containers of words. So first thought and then language. What Sapir and Whorf, his teacher, offered to us is that actually language defines thinking. We only think in terms of our language. So we cannot think what we cannot say, in other words, right? There are these two versions of this theory now, more extreme and kind of more sort of played down. It's the modern version implies that there is sort of bidirectional connection, right? Both the language defines the thinking, but also thinking kind of defines the language. So it's a mutual connection, two-way kind of street, right? So if we agree that our language defines how we think, at least to a large extent, what does it mean when we mix languages, when we code switch and code mix, or when we are multilingual, right? Does it mean that we have this complete salad in our minds that's just, complete disorder? But now we seem to be functional, right? And even there is more and more evidence that multilingual speakers are really kind of intellectually more agile than monolingual speakers. So it actually is helpful to be thinking faster and understanding things easier, right? So what does it mean for our minds if we think in multiple languages, right? Or sometimes in the mixture of languages, right? So these are all relevant questions. Don't ask me, I have no answers to you, right? But these are really good questions to ask. And this is exactly what this discussion about the connection of language and mind is about. And these ideas evolved through time, through different phases, as you can even see in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. We kind of seem to be fluctuating between extremes in our thinking about language and mind. All right, anyways, we are out of time. So thank you very much all for participating in the discussion and thinking about language and speaking about thinking about language. So I hope Mahira will be able to continue next week. Otherwise, you have, and I would like you to leave with this idea. What is language? Whose mind are we connecting to? And what is the implication of multiple languages on our minds or minds of speakers, right? And also what kind of data, what can we be looking at actually when we approach these questions?